Hello everyone, it's Josh again, and welcome back to this mini-series on the basics of how to write a BA or MA thesis in applied linguistics. Today we talk about data analysis. So now you have your data. Maybe you've conducted some interviews, or you've collected some survey responses or questionnaires. Maybe you've recorded some classroom interactions or gathered some archival work and documents. Suddenly, you're staring at pages of transcripts or spreadsheets, thinking, what the heck do I do with all of this? Now, the research begins to feel real because data on its own really is just material. Analysis, it's what turns the material into meaning. When I say analysis, I mean the process of identifying patterns, relationships, structures, and interpretations that help you answer your research question. If you're just summarizing what participants said, or just presenting numbers that you have found, that doesn't really show analytical skills. That's if you organize everything well, at best, your results. Your data is the raw material. Your results is the organized version of that raw material, and your analysis is the deep intellectual work with that material. The first step in analysis is immersion. Read your transcripts more than once. Look at your survey responses very carefully. Sit with your data. Notice recurring words. Notice recurring themes. Notice tensions, contradictions. Don't rush to code immediately. Spend time becoming familiar with what you have, and you should be able to tell me some things about the data, some general story that the data tell. Maybe a couple of interesting points here and there. For example, this seems to happen often, or I have not seen any instances of this, or I was really hoping I would see this, but I've seen this instead. So as I see it, a strong analysis really begins with developing this familiarity with the data. Then comes coding. Coding, in very simple terms, means identifying meaningful units in your data. If you're working with interviews, you might highlight segments that relate to specific concepts driving your research, and that's why you want a very clear theoretical and conceptual framework, because these will really help you find what's important in your data. These drive your analysis. For example, if you're working on motivation, find data segments that illustrate forms of motivation among your participants. This early coding is very, very important. If you'd like, I can tell you more about it in another video, but just to foreshadow, codes can be descriptive at first, and later they become more analytical. For example, you might move from a descriptive code, like feeling nervous, or to a more interpretive sort of category like linguistic insecurity. Coding is not mechanical, so don't expect the process to feel easy. It's interpretive. Interpretive means that you as a researcher help shape the coding process. You find the code and create the code. You don't just reveal it. Without you and your knowledge of the conceptual framework, there's really no code. You're making decisions about what matters and coding accordingly. If you're working with quantitative data, analysis looks different but follows the same principle. You're looking for patterns. Those patterns are frequencies, they're trends, they're relationships between variables, but even here, numbers don't speak for themselves. You interpret them in relation to your research questions and your theoretical framework. Remember that analysis is always guided by your question. That's why I said in one of my previous videos that your research questions are super important. You always look back to them. You always loop things back to them. Now, here's something many students don't realize. Analysis should not be a surprise. If your research design was coherent, your analysis strategy should already be implicit. If you said you were going to conduct thematic analysis, then you should explain how themes were identified. If you said you were going to use discourse analysis, you should show how language was examined closely. So your analytical protocol must align with what you promised in your methodology section. Another key point, not everything in your data needs to be analyzed. And I know this is difficult. In fact, it can be heartbreaking for some. You may have fascinating excerpts that do not directly relate to your research question, so be disciplined. Analysis is selective. You're not writing a documentary of everything that happened. You're constructing an argument based on relevant evidence. And this brings us to structure. When you write your findings or results section, organize around themes or analytical categories, not chronologically and not participant by participant. If you identified 3 major themes, structure your results around those themes. Introduce each theme clearly, provide evidence, quotes, excerpts, numbers, and then move on to interpretation. Do not leave quotations hanging. Always explain why they matter and absolutely choose which ones to use. Don't include every single one of them. Here's a useful distinction for BA and MA students: findings versus interpretations. Findings present what you observed. Interpretation, on the other hand, connects those findings to theory and the existing literature. In some theses, these are separate sections. In others, they're integrated with one another, but either way, you must move beyond simple description. Ask yourself, what does this tell us? How does this relate to what previous studies found? Does it confirm? Does it complicate or challenge any existing research or any strands of research I'm familiar with? It's also normal to encounter messy or contradictory data. Participants may say inconsistent things, or survey responses may not align very neatly with one another. It's reality, so don't take it as failure. Part of analysis is acknowledging this complexity. You can say something like, while most participants expressed X, 2 participants articulated Y, which complicates this pattern. And that demonstrates intellectual maturity. One more thing, very important thing, analysis is not about proving that your initial idea was correct. It's about understanding what the data actually shows and tells. Sometimes your findings will not align perfectly with your expectations. That's completely fine. Research is about being rigorous and being honest, and it's not necessarily about being right. Finally, remember that analysis is iterative. It's cyclical. You may refine your codes, you may reorganize themes, you may return to your data after writing a first draft, and that develops depth. Good analysis requires patience, requires depth, requires sitting with uncertainty, resisting the temptation to simplify too quickly. I see this way too often, and I urge you to think about it and sit with your data. Data is silent until you interpret it. Analysis is where you demonstrate that you can think critically, connect evidence to theory, and construct a coherent argument. It is the intellectual heart of your thesis, and when done carefully, it transforms your project from a collection of materials into a meaningful scholarly contribution to that scholarly conversation we were talking about a few videos back. And in the next video, the final video of this series, we'll talk about writing the thesis as a whole, how to structure it coherently and bring everything together into a polished final document. I hope to see you there.